So I'm gonna try not to take too long here. The question, if I recall, is what are the hardships I'm facing and how am I meeting them? Well, first I just want to say real quick that I noticed that there's a really fundamental issue that was touched on pretty early on, which I've been dealing with myself, and that is the proper valuation of individualism versus collectivism, and how we can integrate the two. I often think that in the way that we process thoughts, it starts with thesis and then it leads to antithesis and hopefully synthesis. And it's not either or necessarily, I think it's both. But as long as we can make sure that we're not sacrificing one for the other, I think we're a little bit too infatuated with individualism in our culture, personally. So some of the hardships I'm facing today are rather familiar, such as not being able to afford higher education, which has led me into a life of toil, where I engage in demanding physical labor 50 to 60 hours a week, and my wife works 40 plus hours a week. It's also worth noting that we are currently renting and we have no children. I should say here that I am so very fortunate and grateful to be one of the only 10% of unionized workers left in this country. That even under the coordinated and intentional weakening of unions by the passage of laws like the right to work and the increased tyranny of the private sector, even then, still, thanks to the power of collective bargaining and to the great legacy of the labor rights movement, my exploitation is thankfully limited. I work this much, sometimes 14 hours a day, not so that I can buy a summer home or a yacht. It is so that we can have a basic standard of living and a dignified life. It is so that at least one of us, my wife, in her limited free time, can afford to get her associate's degree. It is so that we might someday have the security and stability of owning our own home, so that we might extricate ourselves from the crushing conditions of this out-of-control housing market. It is so that we might someday be able to start a family in a safe and stable environment with opportunity for our children. It is so that perhaps if we work hard enough and we play our cards right, I might even be able to go back to school and finish what I could only start at the time, a lifelong passion for learning. But I face other hardships, bigger than myself. I face the hardship of knowing that many of my elected leaders are simply corrupt servants of the people who hold the true power in our society, the titans of business and industry. I face the hardship of knowing that most of my peers are living so close to the financial precipice that they don't have the bandwidth nor sometimes the education to figure out that actually government can and should be a force for good, and that it's the private sector, not the public, that has driven it into the ground. They are unfamiliar with the fundamental conflict between capital and labor and how that conflict profoundly impacts their lives and dictates their opportunities and often their fate. I face the hardship of knowing that those who hold the true power in our society are likely going to get away with our stolen collective wealth again and again, and that many people still don't know who the true enemies of progress are. It is those in the private sector who lobby our spineless and easily corruptible legislators to more easily facilitate their outright domination of almost every corner of the marketplace and the elimination of any real competition. I face the hardship of knowing that my so-called power as a consumer has been rendered so useless that even if I wanted to vote with my dollar by purchasing ethically and sustainably produced goods, that those choices often no longer even exist. After all, when the game is rigged and thus the competition is so steep, how does one compete ethically or sustainably? It is simple, one cannot. I face the hardship of knowing that our culture still celebrates individualism as sacred and to the great detriment at the great expense of the collective. I face the hardship of knowing that those who hold the true power in our society, the capitalists or the bourgeoisie if you prefer, are content to continue their self-serving campaign of extraction and destruction of our very fragile and threatened environment and their exploitation of the proletariat, working class, our most desperate and vulnerable communities. Who will hold them accountable? When will we have had enough? I believe that in order to meet these larger scale hardships head on as individuals, we must talk with each other about these fundamental conflicts and raise class consciousness. Strength through solidarity, an injury to one is an injury to all.
Thanks. Thank you so much. So you wanted to respond?
Yeah.